All right, let's move on to part two about hospitals and understand kind of the phenomena in the last 10 years for sure of how hospitals are organizing more, a little bit differently than previously. So as we said, we've talked about three different hospital types, general community hospitals, academic medical centers, which we said was tertiary or quaternary care, and specialty hospitals. But we also talked about hospitals being organized and owned in different ways. And test question, what is the largest category? So the private nonprofit is the largest. So recall that this is coming out of hospitals originally being church institutions and organized now in a nonprofit way, don't pay corporate income tax, but they're not owned by the government. Government-owned hospitals are considered public hospitals. And then the third way is owned by corporations or private individuals. We call those for-profit or proprietary. There has been a phenomena in the last, as I say, 10 years plus of hospitals, instead of being regular community places that serve that specific community, have reorganized in ways to take advantage of economies of scale. And so what is economies of scale? So think of just regular shops. If you have a shop that sells records, and that little shop, what it has to pay to buy 2,000 records, okay, records, I'm talking about vinyl. You guys don't even know what vinyl is. In the old days, so 2,000 widgets, if you will. But if the store was part of a chain, and instead of selling 2,000 widgets, sold 200,000 widgets, then it can purchase those widgets at a much lower price and therefore charge a much lower price than the smaller store. And that's economies of scale. So this would be Sam's Club, this would be Costco. You can go in these places, big chains of corporations, they buy such big numbers that they can get it cheaper and therefore they can sell it to you cheaper. Okay, so that's economies of scale. We've seen this change in the banking industry. We used to have just little community banks. Now we don't. It's Wells Fargo. It's Bank of America. So hospitals have done the same thing. So kind of think of that as the model. And so they do it for a couple of different reasons. For the economies of scale, to kind of collaborate together over larger geographic areas. And then also think of managed care. Managed care companies, insurance companies, were setting up these provider networks. And so if they could go and say they needed physicians across Western North Carolina, and instead of going and contracting with every individual physician or every individual hospital, if there were systems that provided that coverage and they could just do one contract for the whole system, then it was more organized than 200 individual contracts. So there are different ways that hospitals have done this. Some was consolidation, some we've had expansion, diversified services, and integration, which we're going to talk about now. So the first kind of integration that I want you to understand is horizontal integration. And so that's where you have multiples of the same. So you have, instead of one hospital, you have 3 hospitals. Even at App Regional, they now have 3 hospitals. right? So that's an example of this. We've got one in Blowing Rock, we've got one in down in Linville Falls, and we've got the one in Boone. All right, so that is kind of horizontal integration so that they can share their resources, share their overhead, share their purchasing power, and be a little bit larger system. So that's an example of horizontal integration. The next is vertical integration. And so in classic terms, we think of this as inputs and outputs. And so with a hospital, think about how do you get your patients? Well, you get it through doctors. What are other affiliated services? So we might have the clinic of doctors that patients go see, and then they refer their patients to that hospital. Once they're ready to leave that hospital, they could discharge you to the nursing home or maybe a rehab center. They might have affiliated outpatient surgery centers or perhaps diagnostic imaging, okay? So vertical integration is having different kinds of services within one organization. So we've got horizontal, we've got vertical. But what's really going on is this: full integration. So what we have are these large healthcare systems, Atrium would be a good example, that have multiple hospitals and are also vertically integrated with multiple kinds of services. And so those generally have geographic dispersion throughout the state, and we'll see that in a minute. So think in terms of when you have both vertical and horizontal integration, that is now what we call fully integrated. And this is really the model that we're in now and the model for the future. So we call this an integrated delivery system, which is a network that provides that full continuum of care within a certain population or geographic region. And so sometimes this is a little more complicated to understand, but these organizations are assuming some of the risk, like an insurance company would, for populations that they serve. So as I said, a lot of this came out of the managed care contracting. And so it's easier to contract with one large organization than multiple organizations throughout the whole state. But think in terms too of how this kind of makes sense to deal with some of the problems that we're facing now. If you were a standalone hospital in North Carolina today, and you were in Mecklenburg County, which currently has 140 COVID test positives. I don't know how many patients they have, but you've got a certain need for ventilators. So they've got 140 positive cases in Mecklenburg. Up here in Watauga, we've got 3. In the county I live in, Caldwell, we have 0. In the county to my south, Catawba, they have 4. All right, so you can see there are hospitals in all these areas. They do not have these huge demands for ventilators that these more remote areas, who to date do not have as much need for these ventilators. And so they're just sitting there because maybe they're not using them. But if they were part of one of these big integrated delivery systems, then the integrated delivery system could work in conjunction to potentially redeploy resources throughout their system to where their need is the greatest. So you can just see from this small example kind of the efficiency of a large system as compared to fragmented system and where everybody's on their own. Now that being said, here could be the issue. So let's say there is a little bit of surplus up here in the mountain country of ventilators. Charlotte needs them. Charlotte says, please send them down. the mountain states send them down. Now they don't have them. So is COVID going to become an epidemic up here in the mountain states too? Some would say yes. We don't know. And so if they deploy their resources to someplace else, then they will not be able to withstand their demand that they could have should it spread everywhere. All right. So the local people up here may not be really happy to be sending their resources down to Charlotte and the big cities. And so this is a challenge because most healthcare is consumed locally, not regionally really, not statewide. So you can see how we're organized right now creates some issues for trying to solve problems that are bigger than just a local level. And the COVID crisis is exposing some of the holes and problems that we have in the way that we're organized. And so I'm trying to point some of these things out so that you can be thinking about this in terms of what you learn in this class, of how it is and how it's best that we be organized as a healthcare system in the United States. Now, I gave you an example of an integrated delivery system here in North Carolina, but the same thing is going on from state to state. And New York, which is in absolute crisis, wants the stockpile. They want the national stockpile right now. They need every ventilator they can get. And so they're trying to convince the federal government to get some of those resources to them, once again using the promise that once we get over our peak, we're going to share our resources back with everyone else. Maybe so, but that remains to be seen. So the integrated delivery system has multiple hospitals, the whole spectrum of physicians, all the services, the full continuum of care that we've talked about. And so they try to integrate their information, their billing, contracting, marketing, administration, and general management functions. Here's just a picture that gives you an idea. This is somewhat old. This is Novant. It's progressed a lot further than before. And so we see those red dots of hospitals that are kind of in the Novant network. They continue to try to expand this network. And so there are hospitals and then there are physicians, the blue dots feeding all these hospitals, and then imaging centers and diagnostic centers and surgery centers, etc., supporting all of this. Now, an interesting picture, if you look down in Georgia with Novant, you see all these purple dots. Those are just imaging centers. And at one point, you could see that's a good example of horizontal integration. That in Georgia, Novant did not have a full array of services. They just had imaging centers. And so one might ask, why? Why don't they have a full array of services? And I asked some Novant people this once when we were meeting with them, and this is how this kind of stuff works. Probably somebody that was high up in Novant had a family member, had a friend, a golf buddy that had these imaging centers and wanted to retire and wanted to dump these centers and sell them to somebody. And somebody at Novant said, sure, we'll buy your imaging centers down in Georgia to be part of our portfolio. But you could see that it's not really part of their general overall strategy because they don't have the full array of services down there. So it's just an interesting picture that says a couple of things, just kind of how these things evolve. But secondly, your personal contacts and relationships have a lot more to do with business sometimes than overarching strategy. Here's just some example of Carolinas, which is now called Atrium, and it has stuff everywhere. Now, Carolinas wanted to merge with UNC system, and that's why they changed the name to Atrium. So that was their idea. But what we're going to see in a minute is the federal government does not want what they consider monopolies in any given marketplace. And so though there was this desire for these two huge systems to merge, the initial indication out of the federal review was we are not going to approve this because you would be too big then and you would have market dominance and be able to control marketplaces, and that's not in the best interest of consumers. So we see that this is just an indication. If we did a 2019 slide, it would be even more red dots. Everybody's moving toward affiliation of some sort. Okay, so there are not that many standalone hospitals any longer. App Regional is probably one of the few that I know of that's not affiliated with anyone. Everybody wants them, but think of it this way. You're going to see a slide in a minute. If you're App Regional and you go into a big system, you are going to lose control over your care in the community. Because right now, App Regional can decide for itself. If they go to a part of an integrated system, the integrated system is going to decide what's in the best interest for App Regional. This slide, I want you to understand the point this slide is making. Okay? The greens are the system hospitals, the black's the average, the red is those hospitals not in a system. And what this says is those that are in the systems are more profitable than those that are not. All right? So the indicator, the metric, is that those that are in systems are more efficient in some way and are more profitable. So there's different ways that you can become in one of these systems. Sometimes two might merge together, which is what UNC and Carolinas were trying to do because it was a merger. They were not going to take the name of one of them. They created a new name. If it was an acquisition, then whoever was the acquiring party could have just kept their name. Okay? Kind of explains that. Sometimes you do these joint ventures of two organizations are going to create some new thing. And then you have these alliances or networks that could be working in tandem as well, but they aren't necessarily owned by each other. They're just cooperating and working together. Another way is just kind of virtual organizations where you're really not exchanging any resources, but you're also working together a little bit. So what's the benefit? If you stay independent, you don't have this economic and strategic benefit that you do from these large systems. However, you get to retain control. Okay? So that's the major point there. You don't get the benefits, but you get to retain control. So there are some issues related. There's still research out there of how well are we achieving these economies of scale? What happens to quality? Secondly, as I said, there are antitrust regulations, and so they're not going to let everybody merge together. So the UNC Carolinas is a perfect example. It would have been too big, and so they weren't going to allow to do it. Another question in there is physicians and how do they fit in? So we see that hospitals are buying physician practices as well. Physicians are becoming part of these larger systems. Younger physicians tend to really like this because they just don't want to fool with all that overhead, billing, administrative stuff. However, they also have lost some of their autonomy then. And so, as we said, you cannot have the corporate practice of medicine. Only the physician has a license. But particularly the older physicians, they're kind of a different breed than younger physicians, and they don't like people telling them what to do. All right, so this is just the final slide on this. Here's some other resources if you have any interest in this. But it gives us some idea of both these lectures of how hospitals originated, how they are structured, how they have evolved, how it's worked from a market perspective and efficiency, but because there's not any central control, when you're in a time of catastrophe and greater need, there isn't the oversight that allows you to deploy resources for the whole system in the most efficient way.